think we're ready to get started now. So thanks all for coming to the talk with Isabel, one of the journalists for Socialist Worker, on Marxism versus queer theory. It's going to be the same layout as all the previous meetings you've been to. So I'll pass over to Isabel to start.
Great, thanks. Okay, Marxism versus queer theory. In the red corner, we've got Marx, with his analysis of class and capitalism. And in the blue corner, we've got queer theory, that looks to analyse same-sex desires and gender through the theoretical constraints that the system imposes on us. Now, it's not always as easy as let them fight in the middle, because actually Marxism and queer theory both look to move away from rigid identity politics, look at why things are the way they are and how we can make them better. One of the basic concepts of queer theory is that sexuality is not the result of biology, because throughout history, tens of thousands of years of human history, people weren't classified into categories of homosexual, heterosexual, bisexual. And actually concepts regarding sex and gender vary from society to society, and so queer theory tells us that they are socially constructed. Now, as Marxists, our initial response should be one of solidarity, because actually some of these ideas aren't too dissimilar from what we've already heard today. And both Marxists and queer theorists are disgusted by the sexism and homophobia and transphobia that comes from the system, which means it's important to debate the ideas together. Now, firstly, there are many ideas about what queer theory actually is. There isn't an agreed definition, and those who are most credited to it were either dead when it arose or actually had no idea that they were part of this new queer movement, but I'll come on to that later. So now it encompasses sort of anything on the study of queer, so it's quite slippery to get your hands on. And it's an academic term too. Queer theory and queer politics was born in the universities of America. Marxism, on the other hand, looks to analyse the system that we live in and points to class as the vehicle for change to create a new society, one without exploitation and, as a result, one without oppression. And there are lots of skewed versions of Marx. In the SWP, we look at classical Marxism, we use the works of revolutionaries like Trotsky and Lenin, and that's where we get our analysis from. So a bit of context then about where queer theory came from. In the late 1960s and early 70s, there was a huge political uprising across the world. So in 1968 in France, for instance, student protests led to one of the biggest, largest general strikes in history. In America, thousands of black people were fighting, with the revolutionary Black Panthers, and millions of people were taking part in the anti-Vietnam War movement across the world. And the politics that dominated the time was a version of Marxism, but it was more in line to Maoism and Stalinism than the type of Marxism that we use today in the SWP. And in this context, the modern gay liberation movement sparked. So in June 1969, police raided the Stonewall Inn in New York City. And the Stonewall patrons, who were Latina, black, drag queens, gay and so on, they defended the Stonewall Inn against the police for a series of nights. And from that riot, we saw the birth of the gay liberation movement and the birth of the Gay Liberation Front, which made its way to Britain in about 1970. And this was a radical revolutionary group, despite some contradictory ideas. And the GLF here in Britain was involved in workers' struggles as well, that hadn't quite kicked off yet in the US. So they were involved with the miners' strike that brought down the Tory government in 1974, for instance. And gay liberation meant questioning the divisions between gay and straight people in society and questioning, what we do about it. And liberation was a word that they used, and they were revolutionaries as well. But at the same time, we saw the rise of less radical forces that wanted to work within the system. So there were constant debates about whether people wanted equality or whether they wanted liberation, and whether that could be achieved within the bounds of capitalism. Some gay people completely rejected the idea of marriage as an institution, whereas others wanted same-sex marriage legalised. Those who wanted to get married and sort of share chores and, live your, sort of quiet, happy life were part of this brand of, respectable lesbians, respectable gays, who often excluded the likes of trans people because they wanted to work within the system. And they moved into a strategy of autonomy. Gay liberation was for gay people, women's liberation was for women, and black liberation was for black people. And with the election of Thatcher and Reagan in the 80s, or end of the 70s, early 80s, came an attempt to crush the movements that had come before. So, a rollback on workers' rights and a rollback of the gains of the 60s and 70s. So we saw the defeat of the miners, for instance. We also saw the implementation of Section 28 that banned the promotion of homosexuality in schools and so on. And this came at the exact same time as the AIDS crisis, labelled a gay plague, which obviously it completely wasn't. The first cases were diagnosed in 1981, and because there was absolutely no treatment, people often, HIV turned into AIDS, and hundreds of thousands of people died. By July 1985, over 6,000 people had died in the US. And in Britain, a poll from News of the World found that 51% of people actually favoured total recriminalisation of homosexuality. So this actually strengthened, the strategy of autonomy, and it saw the rise of a particular strand of radical feminism that rejected any political work with men, who they saw, benefited from these patriarchal structures in society. And we also saw the rise of radical lesbian feminism, the idea that women should reject sex and relationships and emotions towards men. That included bisexual people as well, anything that represented a relationship with a man. Now, because of the AIDS crisis, actually, the autonomy politics that were, sort of pushed through, actually began to shift a little bit because, gay men actually started to work with lesbians and straight people around, the AIDS crisis, because the governments of the US and Britain were totally silent on it. People were dying. There was no treatment, so people had to come together. But the collapse of the revolutionary movements of the 60s and 70s actually meant people turned more towards reformism and parliamentary methods, or they looked at intellectual alternatives to Marx, such as the idea of Michel Foucault, who we'll come on to, and more autonomous style politics. And especially when the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union fell in the end of the 80s and early 90s, there was a complete rejection of anything Marxist, even though we know those things were Marxist. We saw things like ACT UP start up in 1987, which fought back against the AIDS crisis and actually used really radical techniques for the first time since Stonewall. And this is where organisations began to use the word queer from the sort of 1990s onwards. And thanks to organisations that got together around the AIDS crisis, there was a cadre of sort of LGBT managers, a middle class, a layer of professionals that took the fight forward. But this was very much in big businesses and corporations. The idea of the respectable gay sort of came back. Now, Marxists obviously take the view that LGBT plus people face oppression because of the class society's reliance on the family. But at the time, people were arguing, actually, if LGBT plus people could be integrated into the family, we wouldn't be oppressed anymore. And obviously, we can see how wrong they were. But on the flip side, we had LGBT activists who found a home in another institution, which was the university. LGBT studies, or queer studies as it is called, offered hundreds and hundreds of things that you could look at, whether it was looking at Charles Dickens and queer theory, or like gardening and queer theory. It was all these things coming together, and there was more desire for unity, a rejection of that early 80s style identity politics, but no political alternative had yet replaced identity politics. So what we actually got was a more inclusive form of identity politics, and this is really where queer theory is rooted. So queer politics began to come out of all of this context in around the 1990s and actually reinterpreted the works of the likes of Foucault. Organisations like Queer Nation, called themselves Queer Nation. They had a militant style, they used direct action. It was meant to, be a more radical form of identity politics. They had strategies, for instance, of outing LGBT people who were, in the higher realms of society and used their class privilege to hide the fact they were LGBT, which obviously shows they had an understanding of class, but also, shows that they thought that all LGBT people should be fighting together, whether you were ruling class or working class. There was this big community that you should be part of, which obviously we know isn't true. Now, the word queer is still used. Obviously, it's meant to be something that's sort of new and edgy and fashionable and brings people together. But actually, the use of queer as an all-encompassing, liberating thing, I think we have to be slightly critical of, because for us, liberation doesn't actually come through labelling yourself. Although your identity and how you identify is important, our liberation doesn't come from what we call ourselves and how we identify. It's how we use that identity to fight back. And actually, for some people, queer is still an insult, and they wouldn't want to use, be identified as queer. And that's why trade union groups still use LGBT plus as opposed to the all-encompassing queer, because actually it is still quite exclusionary for some people. Now, some of the great queer theorists, let's get into them. So I've mentioned Michel Foucault. He was a French historian who wrote in 1979, well, it was translated into English in 1979, The Will to Knowledge. This is regarded as the founding stone for queer theory, despite the fact he died in 1984 and queer theory wasn't first used as a term in 1990, so he actually didn't realise he was going to contribute to this at all. And for queer theorists today, his ideas provide, support for the, radical questioning around sex and gender identity, which was coming out of the 60s, 70s and 80s. But actually, his work was reimagined in the US because originally he was used as a retreat from radical politics, and now they were trying to reclaim him as something that was, more radical and inclusive, but still a rejection of Marxism. Now, Foucault rejects the idea that sex is an expression of human biology. He said that ideas about sex change over time and that humanity isn't divided up into homosexuals and heterosexuals for the majority of time. Instead, certain people were condemned for acts of, sodomy, for instance, which, we heard about this morning, which anyone could commit, but it didn't make you a certain type of person. And Falco says that this changed during the 19th century when other controls over our behaviour were implemented. But he said that these changes and these controls weren't repressive. He said that actually people, far from being told they couldn't talk about sex, actually had it shoved down their throats, whether that was, the hysterical woman who had too much sex, or children that masturbated, or, gay people. And he looks at power as well. He says that power isn't something which oppressed people don't have, and others do have, and actually that power isn't inherently repressive, but creative, he says. Having created this idea of the homosexual person actually can give us all these sort of wonderful things. He said also that power isn't something that can be identified with the state either. Now, the concept of power, according to Falco, means that sex and our sexuality hasn't been repressed. And actually, we shouldn't demand liberation as a result because we're not being repressed. And power isn't doing these bad things to us. Now, what do we agree with there? Well, we would agree in part that sexuality is somewhat socially constructed, because we know that these terms and the idea of these people, was implemented with the rise of capitalism. And we can pinpoint when these identities were used. And from ancient Greece to traditional African societies, there were no words to describe a homosexual, even though people would still take part in these acts. And people have used Falco as well to question the idea that you're born a certain way, that there's an essentialism to it, that you're born the way you are, nothing's going to change, and that's the way it is. Actually, throughout our lives, our sexuality, our gender identities can change. Things are a spectrum rather than like a binary set of boxes or identities. We're not in neat categories. But what Falco does not tell us is how this, sexuality is constructed, how it's constructed, and what links conditions into society as a whole to the changes in sexuality over time. So he doesn't make that link between the change in sexuality and the change in the system. And he says that we can't analyse different periods of history at the same time because they're too far removed, they're too alien to us. And actually, as historical materialists and Marxists, we say the complete opposite, that we have to look at what came before us to understand what's coming next. He also said that there is no single locus of great refusal, no soul of revolt, no source of all rebellion or pure law of the revolutionary. Instead, there is a plurality of resistances, each of them a special case. By definition, they can only exist in the strategic field of power relations. So what he's saying there is that we're all just sort of acting as individuals, and there is no great thing that can bring us together to fight back against the system. It means no to Marxism and revolution, actually yes to separate struggles for each oppressed group against certain parts of the system rather than as a whole. And Foucault denies the link between the history of sex and the development of capitalism. He comments that, although it can be placed in this kind of time, he doesn't want to put these changes in the hands of, the new bourgeois ruling class. He says that they're a good thing, they've just sort of come about, we're not repressed, basically. Whereas Marxists, on the other hand, said that these changes did come about from class society, they're rooted in capitalism for a particular reason, and we're also clear that ideas, don't change society, which is what Foucault's arguing. What we say is that society, as materialists, affects your ideas and changes your ideas. And it's also wrong to say that repression is not part of the problem. Of course it was. Why else would we have the trial of Oscar Wilde? Why else would we have women being locked up for, having children, or, unmarried women, being the scum of the earth in, the sort of Victorian era. And, the idea there's no repression actually completely ignores the reality that people were living. So Foucault's concept of power completely conflates, a range of different relationships as well. He says that, a relationship between husband and wife or mother and father is the same as between the person and the state. And we know that to be, absolutely not true. The state is a body of force, it's a body of violence. And it's a bit complicated, seeing as he wrote about prisons and the state before he wrote about sexuality, so he got a bit confused, I think. But I think hopefully that sums up why bits we agree with him, but definitely bits that we don't. Now, moving swiftly on to the next big queer theorist, which is Judith Butler. I don't know if anyone's tried to read any Judith Butler. Solidarity to you if you have. because she says things in about 50 words when she could say them in 10. But fundamentally, she looks at how sex, gender and sexuality are forms of enforced cultural performance. She's a post-structuralist, so she, similar to Falco, a breakup from Marxism, not seeing the world as one thing, but lots of different things. There isn't, as Falco says, a single agent or a single being that can change the whole of society. We're all individuals walking around a broken system. So in 1990, Butler writes Gender Trouble, and that calls into the question the need for female identity, for feminist practice, and explores the radical critique of identity, particularly with the rise of radical feminism and radical lesbianism. And she argues that gender identities get their stability from the heterosexual matrix which runs society. And actually what she says about her book Gender Trouble, it wasn't meant to come onto the LGBT sphere at all. She actually said it was a critique of feminism. That's what it was meant to be. Her target was feminists. And she actually said in 1994, I would say I'm a feminist before I'm a queer theorist or a gay and lesbian theorist. And she was actually at a dinner party when someone said to her, so what do you think about this queer theory then? And she actually had no idea what they meant, even though they were talking about her book. So it kind of again shows how slippery queer theory is. But what Butler says is that it is important to distinguish performance from performativity. The former presumes a subject, the latter contests the very notion of a subject. Complicated. But anyway, what she's trying to say is that, so obviously she uses language a lot, the difference between performance and performativity and how gender comes into this. So she says that some words are constant, they seek to describe the world. So capitalism is bad, I like Marx. Things that aren't true or false, they just are the way they are. Others are performative, they seek to change the world. So, they can't be described as true or false because they're a description, like, I promise to join the SWP, it's, which you're all going to do after this meeting. So she says to refer to someone as a man or a woman is not to state a fact, it's neither true or false, it's a performance. But there was some confusion by what Butler meant as performance, mainly because she compared, the ultimate type of performance to drag. And actually she had to write a follow-up book that said, that's actually not true. I don't think that drag is the paradigm for subversion of gender. I don't think if we all went out and drag, our lives would be better. But that's actually why her ideas were popular, because she said that gender was just this completely constructed thing. And if you put on some male clothes, that's it, gender's done with. And Butler, examines how it is that we were organised in society, and she rejects the idea that there's an internal sense of womanness or femininity or even gender among any of us. She also rightly questions why the idea of being a woman was based on your biology and your sex, and there's some people who can't have children, there's some people who don't want children. So she did question what makes a woman basically, and I think these are things that are important and that we should also question too. But I think where we should disagree with her is that actually gender isn't just this socially constructed thing that has absolutely no root to you. As Laura said in her last meeting, it does have a material base to your identity. Everyone's born a blank slate, but your sense of gender does come from within. Now, Butler is far, far, far from a transphobe at all. But if you say that gender is completely socially constructed, you're actually partly erasing what it is to have a sense of gender identity, and therefore no one's trans, no one's male, no one's female. But we obviously know that not to be true. Another problem, again, similar to Falco, is that Butler says there is no one site for which to effectively struggle. There's not one banner that can bring everyone together. We just have to all work together in our little groups and come together. So she doesn't see class as a solution. Now, in her later work, she does actually look more towards Engels and Marx, and actually every book she's written is slightly different to the other. But she fundamentally sees society through the lens of gender. And as Marxists, we look to interpret things like gender through the lens of the system. So she's kind of doing it the other way around. And she does debunk reformism. She says that's not enough, but she doesn't say how movements that fight for reform, can go forwards and make real, radical, lasting change. Whereas Marxists, we say that as struggle is the possibility of new opportunities and a new world. And it's also not true, as she says, that resistance is completely compromised. So Marxists, just like Judith Butler, just like Falco, obviously want to move beyond just identity politics and the idea that your identity is what you should struggle around. But the difference is that we are locating identity in the context of capitalism and in the answer being class struggle, whereas queer theorists don't offer us that. So, moving on. Now, I think some of the other key differences is that, we agree that things are socially constructed and have come from the past and so on. Cool, thank you. And we all want to, we as Marxists want to move towards a socialist revolution that's not just going to mean economic change, but social change in terms of our gender, our sexuality, our race, our class, everything. But for queer theorists, their main enemy often is actually straight people. And that is problematic because for Marxists, a lot of our where we are rooted is in class, right, in the working class. And so you can't just exclude all straight workers and you can't just have all gay workers fighting for things. Actually, what brings us together is class, and so our anger can't be aimed at straight people. Similarly, some queer theorists also attack LGBT people for not being radical enough, for not rejecting the system enough. But actually, we don't stand with people like Caitlyn Jenner or RuPaul or people at the top of society, the ruling class. We don't believe in this common community of LGBT people. We've actually got more in common with the workers next to us, whether they're straight or cis or whatever. Queer theorists also attack this idea of respectability. They like I said at the beginning, they sort of see this in a class privilege way. But the queer theorist Michael Warner, he actually criticises unpolitical men who are at home making dinner and actually champions, sadomasochists and sluts and drag queens and trannies is his words. The problem here is that actually radical sex or doing drag or S&M or any of these things that queer theorists point to as breaking the norm, they don't disrupt the present order of things. They don't hit the system at the heart of where it is. Yes, these are individual ways of fighting back, but they don't hit the system hard where it's meant to. Now, the high points of Marxist tradition of sexual liberation have been those that are revolutionary or near-revolutionary situations where workers are struggling to overthrow the present system. And that has opened up space for sexual freedom, such as in the Russian Revolution in October 1917, or in Weimar Republic in Germany, or even the struggle against apartheid in South Africa, which led to some of the first constitutional rights for LGBT plus people. So we can't just accept queer theory's limitations of that. We can't take struggles for gender and sexual freedom forward. We are agents of change, and we can do that collectively. We've got economic crisis, we've got the climate falling apart, we've got the far right on the rise, and we've got the continuing reality of homophobia and transphobia. So we have to struggle and we have to fight. The different struggles that are, on the wall, they're all rooted and connected by the same system. And as queer theorists look to, link these things, but sort of not under the banner of class, not under the banner of the system, but as things that can help each other out. We see them as absolutely intrinsically interconnected and part of the same fight. And everything we've gained so far is what we've won. So it's not good enough to say that we can't fight, we can't struggle, we can't try and win liberation, because everything we have has been fought for. And we should be clear that the fight for liberation isn't actually a secondary issue compared to the economy. Queer theorists are fighting for queer liberation, as they put it. As Marxists, we're not just fighting for a better economic system, we're fighting for a better overall system, we're fighting for everything to change. And the crux of the matter is that, Butler's right and Falco are right when they say that these things do have a root in history. They've not always existed and they can be changed. But the crux of the matter is that gender is a powerful tool in class society that reinforces the productive and reproductive role of the family. And if you don't link it in capitalism, you can't overcome it. Or in class society either. So removing the economic basis to our oppression, you take away that justification for gender. You take away the importance of what your sexuality is. You take away the need for oppression entirely. And the reality is that's never going to change under capitalism. And unfortunately, that's not going to change if we follow the confusing works of queer theorists either. Lenin wrote for a reason that it's revolutions that are festivals of the oppressed, and that is what we have to fight for, because it's not good enough to just reject the system that we live in and try and work out our place within it. We've got to try and reject the system as a whole. So I'll leave it there.